Recently, I've been looking at my CBT1 gameplay for Wuthering Waves, and I was like, okay, you know what? I just kind of got back into PGR, and it's so cool to see kind of the similarities that Kiro's going. So whether you've heard of PGR, whether you played it, whether you've seen some of the gameplay, I'm sure that at some point you've probably heard that Kiro's cooking with the overall combat, and that is one of these things that gets praised with probably the most out of anything, other than the pity system and how generous that can be. But most of the time, people are talking about the combat. I think it's important because I want to kind of create a discussion on the Wuthering Waves stuff, because I've seen some people wondering if it's going to be too casual, is it going to be too try hard, what are they going to go for, are they going to be able to balance it? I think PGR kind of answers that question. So outside of the actual ping system, which I think is not super complicated, but it is a little bit harder to understand versus the Wuthering Wave system, where they're just kind of opting to use like E, Q, R, which is a little bit better to understand as like a casual person who maybe isn't too familiar with action RPGs, versus the ping system, because it takes a couple of seconds to kind of get used to it, because you're trying to dodge, you're trying to run, you're trying to do your basic attack, then on top of that you're trying to match colors and all that kind of stuff. So it can be kind of overwhelming, especially for your screen. And the fact that they kind of took the more casual route with Wuthering Waves, honestly, I think is probably better for a general audience. But I do, I'm going to miss the ping system. Kind of people are on the fence about that, but overall, I think it's probably for the best. But that doesn't mean that Wuthering Waves is going to be considered easier or less sophisticated mechanically, because you can see a lot of different similarities between the ways that they work and how the characters actually work on the field. So honestly, the biggest thing about PGR is actually the gimmicks and the different combinations of teams that you have. Really, it comes down to the characters themselves and how complex they get. Now, Gen 1, which is kind of like the first wave of characters that PGR launched with, was a little bit easier to understand, right? They didn't have too much kind of going on, very basic stuff. But now if you look at PGR, it's like they have crazy stuff they can do. There's so many different things that characters can do, so many different combinations, especially with different teammates and all that kind of stuff. And I think that's going to translate very well to Wuthering Waves, because a lot of people have been saying like, hey, some of these characters on Wuthering Waves look a little basic. And honestly, I think they're going to go a very similar route, where they have a lot of easier to understand characters as they kind of progress into more, progressively harder characters to kind of understand. It gives you that kind of nice ramp up, and PGR is very good at doing that as well. So they kind of had that like nice little barrier where each character got a little bit more complex, a little bit more understanding, and it keeps you engaged. It keeps you kind of learning, because now you take all the basics that you had from the Gen 1 characters, and then you start using them on like the next characters, and then the most complicated characters. Now you have all that skill set. And I think it's just a nice little thing from casual to like intermediate to like, you're trying really hard to do all the different things you can do and trying to get most optimized out of all the combinations while not feeling like overwhelmed, because a lot of these characters can actually be played pretty casually without having to, master every single technique and every single mechanic if you're not going for the highest stats. Now you can kind of ink some of those out, to do the most sophisticated, most optimized things, but these characters don't make you forced to play that way. It's just kind of like an optimization thing if you choose to play that way yourself. I also think that Wuthering Waves is taking notes here, because their QTEs are being more optimized. They're allowing you like a little bit more team comps, as well as the ecosystem getting a little bit of a revamp, making them a lot more useful. They're also staying out on the field a little bit longer. They're able to parry, and it just means that they're more valuable on the field. It gives you more options to do. Now, obviously, as a casual, you may not use every single option that you have, but the fact is options usually work better for just kind of having that nice little transition, I would say, from beginner to intermediate, because you're starting to kind of understand more mechanics, and the more stuff that you can kind of do, you can kind of cherry pick what you want to do at certain points and at certain times. So it's just kind of a nice flex of, kind of going between intermediate and casual. And I think that they're finding that balance very, very well. They did it in PGR, but for Wuthering Waves, I think the barrier to entry is very low. The ceiling for these kind of characters are pretty high, because I was doing some crazy things in CBT1, and that wasn't even scratching the surface, because I wasn't even too familiar with my characters, and I didn't even have like an optimal team comp that I was doing. I was just kind of flying and, Hawaiian and doing all that kind of stuff, which was still fun. It was still a fun time to do. But I think there's a kind of thing where you can start to make teams in a different light, in a different way, and try to be a little bit more competitive if that's kind of what you want to do. And I just think that Wuthering Waves is knocking it out of the park, and I'm excited to see what they do in CBT2, because I think the translation of the, overall changes and the smoothness that they made to the combat is really going to translate to something that we can see, and just kind of the future of Wuthering Waves characters as well, because I do think that they're going to get more complex as we go, and just giving a nice little, hey, here's kind of like the basics that this character can kind of do. It's really beginner friendly, but if you want to get into the crazy stuff and you want to start like min-maxing some of the different potential like perks and like, passives and stuff like that, you can also think about that, some of the different, items and stuff like that, team comps. And I think it just gets a little bit more progressive if you're willing to put that time in, but it's not going to be something that you have to do in order to get most of basic rewards. It's going to be for the people who want to get the most out of the most, and they have all the time in the world to do it.